I explain why I'm becoming a CNN analyst. Plus, Cam Edwards joins the show to talk about the impact of guns on the upcoming midterm elections. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun. I had one friend.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and check out our free weekly newsletter if you want to get the latest in gun news across the country delivered right to your inbox once a week, every week. You get a nice summary of what's going on, all the biggest stories. And then if you want to dive a little bit deeper, you can also become a member, which is how we fund the Reload here. And you'll get access to exclusive pieces of analysis, exclusive stories that you can't find anywhere else. So head on over to the Reload and check out those options today. But we are talking with a friend of mine whose show I was just on earlier today, Cam Edwards of Bearing Arms. How are you doing, Cam?
I'm good. It's good to see you again, and thanks for coming on, Cam and Company, earlier today. That was a fun conversation. I'm looking forward to this one too.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked a little bit about my new role at CNN, which I'll talk about with Jake later on, and then we talked about some of the longer term implications in the gun world, things like what's going on with the courts, the reactions by state legislature to the Supreme Court's Bruin decision. We had a great conversation about that. And I figured on this show, we could talk maybe a little bit more about the short term here with the midterm elections coming up in 3 weeks now? Is that?
Yeah, less than 3 weeks now. So,
yeah, it's moving fast.
It is. And I read your piece of the Reload pointing to this new poll. This was it a Siena poll?
New York Times
and Siena. Yeah. Showing just 1% of likely voters saying that guns were their top priority, which, we have seen. I think other polls have shown that support's not quite as high. Although it's interesting when you break it down by party. I think this is one of the problems for Democrats is that guns and gun control is still a big issue for Democratic voters, but it's not nearly as important an issue for Republicans and independents. And that's one of the reasons why I think you're starting to see this swing in the polling, the generic ballot switching back to a Republican lead in some cases or a bigger Republican lead in some cases, because I don't think the Democratic push for gun control is resonating with American voters right now.
Yeah, I think the way the New York Times put it in their write-up was back in June, because we had this historic summer for the issue of guns in America, right? With the Uvalde shooting, of course, being a huge event that's it's one of the worst massacres in American history, of course, and of course the police response to it was another hugely controversial part to what happened. And in response to that, you saw the first really new federal gun restrictions in several decades. They were on the more moderate side, I guess, of compared to what a lot of gun control advocates want, but they were still new restrictions. There was a bipartisan bill. The president signed it. And then, of course, we also got a historic ruling from the Supreme Court in Bruin, which of course, we talked about more of the implications on your show. And people should head over and listen to that episode, of course. But back in that time period, you saw polling, including this New York Times poll, that had guns. Now, it was never the number one issue.
Right.
But it was up at 8-9% compared to 1%. And the New York Times notes that among the people who had it as their top issue, they preferred Democratic control of Congress. So with this issue receding in this poll, at least, that indicated it was a good issue for Democrats at the time in the summer. I think it is. It's certainly not good for the state of the Democratic Party's attempt to try and hold on to control.
No, I think you're right. And it's interesting how this has played out. As you note, earlier in the year, this was an issue that was polling much better. And you look at what's going on in Ohio, for example. Nan Whaley, who is the former mayor of Dayton. She was the mayor of Dayton at the time of the mass shooting in 2019, I believe it was. And she basically based her gubernatorial campaign around the idea that Mike DeWine promised he would do something about gun control, and he didn't. Instead, he sided with the gun lobby, and he, signed constitutional carry, and he signed the, armed school staff bill. And that message never really took off in Ohio. Like, DeWine has been leading handily in every poll. I think that one of them, he's up by like 23 points. He is, the Senate race is very tight, right? Between JD Vance and Tim Ryan. But the governor's race, I mean, DeWine is just, clobbering Whaley, who basically ran a campaign on gun control. And I think we're seeing that same dynamic play out in Texas. Beto O'Rourke obviously tried to use the shooting in Uvalde to make gun control a top issue in this campaign. But one of the last polls I saw that came out of Texas, and it's been a few weeks since we've had one, did ask, what are your top issues? And for Republicans and independents, it was border security. I mean, by far. For Democrats, it was abortion. The second top most important issue for Republicans and independents was inflation. For Democrats, it was guns. And so I think that they are finding themselves out of touch with Americans. Inflation, job security, those kitchen table issues, I think, have emerged once again as the primary issue because things aren't getting any better. Every time we go to the grocery store, it's costing us more money. It's starting to cost us more money when we go fill up our tank. And while Joe Biden was happy to take credit for gas prices going down, all of a sudden it's, the oil companies' fault and Putin and whoever else when the prices start going up. I don't think Democrats are doing themselves any favors, but I also wonder too, Stephen, whether or not the few months we've had since the Bruin decision coming down, we know that there's been this influx of people who have sought concealed carry permits in these may issue states. But I don't know. I wonder if to one degree or another, there hasn't also been a shift in position once again back towards support for the Second Amendment and, folks being less inclined to support various gun control policies.
Yeah, it's interesting theory. Certainly, I mean, it is common, right, for us to see an increase in support for gun control in the immediate aftermath of something like Uvalde, something horrible, and something that captures the attention of the whole nation, and then that things from that point, you tend to see a lessening of support, a drop for support in those same gun control policies. Although I will say that, and as we've talked about this before, but one of the areas where there was an exception to that rule this time around was with what is actually seems to be the top priority for Democrats, which is an assault weapons ban, a ban on AR-15s and AK-47s and and similar firearms. And something that, as you noted, Beto, he's obviously been running a somewhat all over the place campaign on the issue of confiscating AR-15s and AK-47s, which was this marquee issue when he ran for president, but he's been sort of back and forth on that. But you've also seen the House pass the first assault weapons ban bill since the assault weapons ban of 1994. And so it's clearly a top priority among Democrats, but you actually saw a drop in support for assault weapons ban in the immediate aftermath of Uvalde in a lot of the polling that was done. And so that's been interesting to watch as well.
It has been. And again, I think it's I mean, I won't call it a misstep on the part of Democrats because I think they're doing what they want to do. But again, I think it is a misstep in terms of that's not, when, and I always take, polls about views on gun control with a lot of grains of salt, but I'm always fascinated when a pollster will ask, not only do you support a law, but how much good do you think it will do? Right. And it seems to me that, while folks may support, you might find, 55, 60% support for a ban on so-called assault weapons. People don't necessarily think it's going to do a lot of good. which is one of the reasons why I think this isn't a top issue, because I think there are a lot of what I call soft supporters of gun control. They want to do something, right, to fight violent crime. They want to do something to make sure that things like what happened in Uvalde don't happen again. But they don't really know what. They hear a lot about gun control. So, all right, well, let's go there, right? But I think if you present them with other options, in terms of, in the case of Uvalde, we can talk about, increases in school security. We can talk about things like arming teachers. I think all of a sudden gun control becomes, in many cases, less attractive. John Lott also did some research recently where they surveyed people about red flag laws, and then they kind of filled in the details about how the laws work in practice, and support for the laws went down. So sometimes when we learn more about these laws, they become less popular. I know you've talked about, the universal background check referendum in Maine and Nevada in 2016, right? And now, the supposed 80% support for universal background checks was like 50%, and actually 48% in the state of Maine. Right. So, I don't think there's one thing going on here to explain it, but it is clear that gun control is not the winning issue that Democrats thought it was going to be. I'm hard pressed to think of a campaign right now that is really out front with a gun control message, even when you think they would be, like the Arizona Senate race, for example. Mark Kelly, is not talking about gun control. He's running against a guy who builds ghost guns in his garage, and he's not bringing up guns. He
found a gun control group.
Exactly, right?
That's a good point. Yeah, I mean, there are some, mainly like Beto, I think Val Dennings in Florida, but those are generally not considered to be terribly competitive races.
Right. That's the other thing. I mean, you can't really point to a candidate who's been successful at making gun control an issue this cycle. On the other hand,
do you think that holds the other direction as well? Can you think of candidates who've made gun rights the central issue of their campaign and are having success with that?
So that's what's interesting, because I know that you had written about the NRA spending, and just like gun control groups have been cutting ads where half the ad or more is about abortion. Mm-hmm. The NRA has cut some ads that are about crime. I think you have seen,
which, by the way, I think that's another sort of, you talk about how polling's not everything, right? And I agree with that. And we have this New York Times poll. We have 2 polls from YouGov that are commissioned for different publications, but they basically show the same thing, which is that people listing guns as their most important issue has dropped by about half since June. So similar trend. The numbers are slightly different, but we have that polling. But then we also have some non-polling indicators like the gun groups themselves. They're still spending, right? They're certainly still out there raising money and spending millions of dollars in a lot of these big battleground races. But there's a tempering of the message, which if it's Evertown and Giffords, you're seeing abortion as the leading issue in the ad. That's the first thing they talk about. They might talk about guns after that as sort of trying to do connect the two things as being the candidate being extreme on social issues, and then the NRA has done, to their credit, I guess they've focused more on guns than just my subjective judgment of watching the ads. The NRA is more focused on guns, but they do mix in a crime element in the same way of trying to connect the two. And in fact, they did a whole ad in Pennsylvania that is just about crime and doesn't mention guns at all. So that's sort of another indicator that maybe the gun groups are seeing this as not the top issue of the campaign.
It is. And two, I think, some of these states are not, I mean, look, Pennsylvania is not Wyoming when it comes to views on the Second Amendment, right? So crime as a sort of proxy for your ability to protect yourself kind of makes sense. We're seeing this in New York too, right? Lee Zeldin there've been some polls that show Hochul up by like 11 points, but there've been some polls that show Hochul up by like 2 or 3 points too. So I don't know where that race is. Let's say it's somewhere in the middle. That's pretty competitive. And, I'm kind of, on the one hand, I'm kind of surprised that Lee Zeldin has not made more of an issue out of the Concealed Carry Improvement Act. I hate calling it that, but that's the title, in New York. He did issue a statement, about the special session. He made a good comments after the Bruen decision was handed down, but he's not out there, demanding that people have the right to carry. This is not part of his like stump speech, and it's not part of his standard attack on Kathy Hochul, or at least it's not one that's really resonating in campaign ads or things like that. And I'm kind of surprised by that. But I mean, you look at New York, and, the Democrats have such a huge voter advantage that any Republican who's going to win statewide is going to have to peel off most independent voters in order to do that. And that means you're probably going to have to moderate your message, right? And so you talk about crime and you talk about individual safety, and you don't talk up gun control, but you don't necessarily say, you know what, I'm going to make sure that you can carry a gun in Times Square. Like maybe you don't cut that campaign ad in New York. But
politically it makes sense.
Right.
But that's the thing, like, can you think of somebody off the top of your head who's laser focused on this issue on either side? And I think the answer is no. Even Beto, to a large degree, he's not necessarily focused on the issue. He does talk about it more than probably a lot of other campaigns, and obviously Uvalde happened in Texas, so it's more of an issue. But I just can't think of a good example of somebody who's run in the general.
Right.
You had plenty more talk about guns in the primaries, but the general election, I don't know that this has been the big focus. I mean, it's the economy, it's inflation, it's crime, right?
Yeah. Well, and yeah, absolutely. And if you're a Republican, given the advantages that you have over Democrats on issues like the economy and crime, yeah, why ruin a good thing, right? If that's what the voters want to talk about, then talk all day long about that. So in that sense, I guess you could. I don't want to say that guns are a non-issue, though, because I think that they do have an impact, certainly on our individual safety. And I think in many cases it is sort of a proxy when we talk about crime. And, don't forget, I mean, it was back in August that Everytown for Gun Safety released that memo about how they wanted Democrats to frame this as Republicans are soft on crime because they don't support gun control. Right. That was supposed to be ads. Yeah,
they've done ads with that message themselves. Sure.
And that was supposed to be that the narrative going into, the fall in November is like, they're the ones who are soft on crime. They're the ones who don't care about public safety because they don't support, a gun ban. What's kind of interesting to me is that, it doesn't seem like a lot of Democrats, you're right, the gun control groups have run those ads, but I've seen a couple of Democratic politicians kind of, make that claim, but the Democrats just don't seem to want to talk about crime in general. And while I think that they are more inclined to talk about gun control, as you say, like right now, abortion's the bigger issue for the Democratic Party. And so that's their lead.
Especially after that referendum.
In Kansas, right? Absolutely. So what's interesting, and I don't know how long we have here, but there are a couple of referendums on Second Amendment issues on the ballot this November. There's a good amendment in Iowa, and there's a very, very bad voter referendum in Oregon. And I'm very curious to see, how those play out. Like if there is a red wave, if Republicans overperform. Right now there's this weird three-way race in Oregon for governor.
Yeah.
And the Republican Christine Drazan has I think the Real Clear Politics polling average is like a 2-point lead because you've got this Democrat turned independent who's also pretty pro-gun. She's talked about a couple of things like raising the age to purchase from 18 to 21. But generally speaking, Betsy Johnson, I think at one point had an NRA rating when she was in the state legislature. So there's this fascinating race for governor. And then you've got this ballot referendum that would establish like a permit to purchase with mandatory training. It would establish basically a database of gun owners. There's a magazine ban component to it. And it's, by the way, like according to the state's own fiscal analysis, it's going to generate something like, $20 million in revenue, and it's going to cost like $50 million to implement. So, the sheriffs have come out against it. Many sheriffs have. I'm really curious to see what happens there. This is a state where you would think a gun control referendum would do pretty well. The one poll that I've seen had 51% support for it. So
that's not great.
No, it's not for Oregon.
Yeah, especially given the disconnect, as you alluded to earlier in the show, and we've talked about before, between polling and referendum votes on gun control measures. I think, the referendums will be really interesting to watch, just like they were in 2016 with the universal background check referendums, because, what a poll tells you and what the ultimate poll that really matters tells you can often be two very different things. Because as you talked about in there earlier, there's this sort of idea of, soft support for gun control. If you get asked about it on a survey, in broad terms, there's probably a lot of people who might be agreeable to all sorts of ideas as a potential solution to gun violence, which nobody wants and likes. And so, but when it comes down to here's a specific proposal that you got to go and vote on, does it translate as well? I mean, there's, in addition to the John Lott survey that you mentioned, there's also 97%, which is this new sort of more moderate gun control group, or whatever you want to call them. They did a similar survey where they asked, where one of the conclusions from it, and it's much broader than just this, but one of the conclusions was like, sure, gun owners will say that they support these certain proposals when asked generally, but they often have a lot of reservations about the more specific details of those types of proposals. And you start to lose a lot of support as you get more into those details.
Right. And those details, look, they generally don't come up in a survey, but they are going to come up in a ballot initiative, in a ballot campaign. So, I think that's, I'm interested to see what happens. Iowa's referendum is also kind of interesting just because of the quirk of how it's written. So we've seen a lot of these state constitutional amendments protecting the right to keep and bear arms. Iowa's was supposed to be on the ballot, I think it was 2 years ago, but there was some there was some procedural error in the legislature. So they had to go back and restart the process all over again. And so the language of this ballot initiative says that the right of the people, and I'm paraphrasing here, but the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed and shall be interpreted, by the courts with strict scrutiny in mind. They use the term strict scrutiny explicitly, which is interesting because the Supreme Court has said,
rejected that.
We're not using tiered scrutiny, right? We're using history, text, tradition. That's the test.
Right.
So it's this.
Although strict scrutiny might actually result in more laws being struck down than, of course, that's an open debate, but
right.
Generally accepted, that would be even more gun control laws would be, or gun laws would be struck down under strict scrutiny.
That is the debate. And, I guess, I don't know if we could, we'll see. It seems like there's an awful lot of gun laws that are getting put on hold right now, but
that is an interesting one to put on the ballot, though. How judges should interpret the Second Amendment is not usually a referendum question. You know what I mean?
Right. No, you're right. I think there might be 2 other states that have similar language in place, but I think, and again, the intent was for, 15 years after Heller, these lower courts were using intermediate scrutiny and just upholding everything. And, this was the way to get around that, to say, no, stop doing that. This is a fundamental right, treat it as such. And I suspect that it's going to pass. I'm curious to see how big the margin is going to be. There doesn't appear to have been a whole lot of spinning against this ballot measure, and I'm not aware of any state referendum to either, put a right to keep and bear arms in the state constitution or to update that right to make it more explicitly clear. I'm not aware of any of those measures ever failing. Are you? I'm trying to think about it, 'cause there have been a few over the past 10 or 15 years, but they've all passed with like 65 to 80% of the vote.
Yeah. I'm not aware of any failing either, but most states already have a provision similar to the Second Amendment in their state constitutions. So it's not a super common modern thing to see, obviously. But that is an interesting twist on it, where you're sort of amending it to also lay out the judicial test for any gun laws in the state. So it will be interesting to see how that fares at the polls, and then how it actually gets implemented in practice as well, especially given that it now would conflict with the Supreme Court's new standard. Speaking of which, though, one thing, we obviously talked a bit about Bruen and some of the impacts, more of the, on legislation and long-term outlook on gun laws generally. But I'm interested in what you think its impact is on this election that's happening here in a couple of weeks. Is part of this decline in interest on guns, if it is happening, right? As far as the polling is established and some of these other indicators, the fact that the Supreme Court has handed down this ruling, and now a lot more gun owners are confident that even if laws are passed, they won't necessarily withstand this test. Do you think that's having an effect, or is that too high-minded?
I hope that that's not the case, because I have no doubt if the Democrats felt like they had the votes in the House and the Senate, they would try to pack the court. They would try to overturn Bruen and McDonald and Heller. They've said as much. So I would hope that, gun owners would not be getting complacent just because we had a good court decision in Bruen. It's important to prevent the court from being packed and those decisions being undone. But I think for most people, the Bruen decision didn't have an immediate impact because, most states were already shall issue. Now, there are some population-rich states, obviously California being one of the may issue states, New York, being another, along with New Jersey. There are now, tens of millions of people who have the right to bear arms that they were not able to exercise a few months ago, at least theoretically. But, look, California is a reliably Democratic state, as is New Jersey, and they don't even have elections. Well, I guess they have their federal elections, but no statewide elections this year. We've already talked about New York and how it's not a top issue even there. So I don't know that Bruen is actually having a huge impact. Not the way that the Dobbs decision seemed to have had, at least for a while. And I think, again, even now, the Dobbs decision is having less of an impact on the race. But, the real, I think, ramifications of Bruen are going to be felt in the courts for a while. And then hopefully the legislatures get the message. Ideally, that's what happens, right? When they get smacked down enough, we stop seeing so many of these gun control laws. But I don't know that Bruen is having a big impact on any particular race right now. I do think it's worth watching to see what happens in New York in terms of the congressional races and in terms of state legislative races, because what we saw in Virginia in 2021. When, Republicans took all of the statewide offices, they recaptured the House of Delegates. That was not supposed to happen in Virginia. And I think that gun control was the sleeper issue of that election. We saw many Second Amendment sanctuaries. Too, right? Exactly. Yeah, absolutely we did. Yeah. And we saw so many Second Amendment sanctuaries in Virginia. And, these same counties, the turnout had increased and it was a redder vote than 4 years earlier. And I think guns had a big deal to do with it. I think you had a lot of people who were waiting 2 years to cast their vote. They were so ticked off. And I think that same dynamic may be at work in New York City, or excuse me, in New York State, once you get outside of New York City in the suburbs. So there could be some upset, swing district races in the state legislature, and maybe even, some congressional districts too.
Yeah, that could be, because New York would be the area where sort of the post-Bruin legislation has had the most practical impact on people, because it's severely restricted the ability of those who previously had concealed carry licenses in places like upstate New York to actually carry their guns where they used to be able to carry them. And so that is perhaps one area where, like Virginia, where people were, I think there's a lot more intense political pushback when a gun law directly impacts people's lives instead of sort of theoretically impacts their rights or something along those lines. You're going to have a more ferocious response when, a more engaged voting community and among gun owners, if they're directly impacted. If there's something that they used to be able to do and now they cannot do, I think that drives voting far more than sort of discussions in law journals about
right.
What standard to use or whatever. And so I think it's a good point about Bruin that there hasn't been an immediate impact on most people, and even in places where obviously some of these states are being forced to issue permits now that weren't doing it previously. And so that is a practical impact, but it's one that's is not likely to harm your everyday person who's not going to really notice it, other than people who are going to get the permits and they're going to look at it positively, right? That might generate some interest in voting, like in New York, because if you're having the ability to get your carry permit for the first time, and then that is restricted again because of the politics of your state, maybe you're much more likely to vote on that particular issue. But I do think generally your point makes a lot of sense. Bruin has not led to much immediate, it has led to some immediate consequences in the courts, but not ones that necessarily have extremely wide-reaching practical implications yet, right? Unlike Dobbs, which has ended up with a lot more restrictions on abortion in a lot of different areas, not everywhere, of course, but that's an interesting, I think, point of view on how Bruin is really, whether it's why it might not be driving votes in most places. It's certainly something that I think will take longer to have a more political impact, I guess. But I guess one thing I would say, though, to counter that, because I think it's a good point, but you do hear from activists, I've heard from activists talk about, I don't need to worry as much about these gun laws that might be passing because the Supreme Court's going to strike most of them down, after Bruin. Like there's not a lot of these modern type restrictions that are more controversial among gun owners that will actually survive scrutiny now. And so I don't know.
You don't put all your eggs in one basket. I mean, if that, and you're right, that attitude is out there, I think it's the wrong attitude to have. If you think first of all, the Supreme Court accepts one out of every 10,000 cases that it's asked to. Mm-hmm. So if you think the Supreme Court is going to be the magic backstop that's going to accept every gun control case where a lower court, decides that some law from the 1790s it bears enough resemblance to a modern day gun control law that it can be upheld, I think you're fooling yourself. We as Second Amendment supporters have to be engaged in the legislative arena, in the judicial arena. We've got and hopefully we've got an executive that's going to respect the Second Amendment too. We also have to be fighting the court of public opinion All of those venues matter. So I think it's way short-sighted to say, the Supreme Court's got to save us. And also, again, as I said, Democrats right now, if they had the votes, would pack the Supreme Court. We wouldn't have a majority. And one of the first things that they would do is overturn the Heller decision. Listen, if it gets to that point, Stephen, I would also say that we would have bigger fish to fry. Speaking as a nation, I think that would be a horrible step to take. And I hope that we don't ever get there. But
it's not impossible. Yes,
it's not impossible, right? Yeah, strange. So I would just say, don't take the legislative side lightly, and don't think that Bruin gives you a chance to disengage, because it doesn't. It's always better to stop a bad bill from becoming a bad law than to try to overturn a bad law in court.
Yeah, I think from a practical standpoint, that's absolutely correct. I do wonder how much of an effect it has on people, because I mean, I'm still skeptical ultimately. I think that's maybe an activist thing that you hear from people who are highly engaged, and they're probably going to vote anyway, frankly. If you're that kind of person who's following gun news that closely, you're probably a voter regardless, I would think. And you're sort of average person who votes in a presidential election and might vote in a midterm. It's probably not top of mind for you, the Bruin decision, one way or the other, I would imagine. And how much of this, decline in people saying that guns are their most important issue is a result of the bipartisan gun legislation? I'm interested in your take on that. Mitch McConnell was quoted as saying that part of the reason the Republicans passed this bill, agreed to support this bill, was to take this away as a midterm issue. Did it work?
I think it probably did to some degree. Because again, if you think about it, so even, right after the shootings at Robb Elementary, the murders at Robb Elementary, gun control, I think, was seen as the most important issue by, it was topping out around like 18% of the population or of the electorate. It still wasn't the number one issue, right? It was still inflation. It was still the economy. And since then it's slid. So gun control is never the top issue in an election. It's not. It's one of those issues that plays at the margins, right? Which is why the NRA was able to be so effective, because it, if it said to its members, hey, this is the candidate you should vote for, then, that candidate could reasonably expect maybe a bump of anywhere from, 3 to 5%, because gun owners would turn out and they would vote for them. But it wouldn't guarantee them a victory, but they play at the margins. And so did the passage of the bipartisan gun bill take gun control off the table for some Americans? I'm sure it did. I have no idea how many, because again, there's so many other factors,
right?
And I think the 800-pound gorilla in the room right now is inflation. And actually, as we've been in the room, Stephen, it's inflated to 900 pounds. So, that's the thing. I mean, like, with what's going on economically, that's just crowding out room for so many other issues. And guns are one of them.
Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately that makes a lot of sense. I'm sure that the bipartisan gun bill, whatever people think of the merits of that, and obviously it's very controversial still, it probably had some effect on reducing the interest in, because it was something, right? And they did something, right? That's the classic refrain. So do something. Well, they did something. Whether or not it's effective in preventing future shootings is obviously up for debate, and will be debated forever probably. But it was something, and so it probably had some effect. But I do think you're right that ultimately, if you look at that New York Times poll, what the most important issues are, or those YouGov polls, the top two are the economy and inflation, which are really kind of the same issue.
Yeah.
They say they're pocketbook issues, right? That's what everybody calls them. And they drive a lot of what happens in American politics. And yeah, so it does seem like as we've gotten closer to the election, that's really driven to people to think less about other issues. Not that it won't have any impact, not that abortion won't have any impact or that guns won't have any impact on this election, but clearly this election seems to be far more focused on those core economic issues at the cost of focus on any other issue, really.
Yeah, and I suspect that will probably be to Second Amendment supporters' advantage, because I think that just based on what things look like 2.5 weeks out, I think things look pretty good for Republicans to at least take back the House. And I honestly don't know how much stock to put in any particular poll, but I tend to try to look at the trends. And you look at the Pennsylvania Senate race, for example, and the trends show a tightening of that race. Very tight race in Nevada, very tight race in Georgia, very tight race in Arizona right now. So, I mean, it's entirely possible that Republicans could end up with, 53, 54 seats in the Senate. It's also possible that Democrats could end up with 53 or 54 seats in the Senate. So, the outcome, even though guns might not be the most important issue, the outcome of the midterms will be very important to the issue of guns and our Second Amendment rights going forward.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, one of the reasons why guns becomes such a politically salient issue is that it can motivate some percentage of people, and in tight races, that's all. That could be the deciding factor. Even if it's not the number one issue. So I don't want to try and paint this as not mattering at all. It's just interesting to see the trend go from, especially so quickly, to politics moves fast, man. Uvalde happened in May. The bipartisan bill was passed in June, and I think the Supreme Court ruling was in June as well. It's only been a couple months since those things happened, and what's our, Americans listing guns as the top issue is already back down to 1%. That's a fast move, but it does at the same time, I talked about earlier a few months back that elections tend to, especially midterm elections, tend to have a certain cycle to them where the party in power looks like it's going to get creamed, several, 6 months out, the polls look terrible. Especially in an environment where the president has really bad approval ratings and the economy's down, they look like they're going to get creamed. Then you see a tightening over time, and there's a lot of chatter about why that's happening and momentum and so on and so forth. And there's the in-power party's going to keep control. And then once you get closer to the actual election, things start to broaden out again. You get where we're at now, which is people think that the out-of-power party is probably going to have a pretty good night and regain control of at least part of Congress. I don't know. Does that sound like a familiar pattern to you? And do you think we're following it here?
I mean, it is a familiar pattern. I think we are generally following it here, but not always. I mean, look, the Texas governor's race shows no signs of tightening up. Georgia governor's race shows no signs of tightening up. Ohio governor's race, no signs of tightening up. If I'm looking at the races that are tightening, it's that the Democrats who were favored to win are now falling back into sort of toss-up category.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing any races where Republicans who were favored to win are all of a sudden now it's getting a little iffy, right?
Yeah, but that's what I mean.
All of those races seem to be tightening in one direction.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's not always the pattern in every election cycle. I don't think so.
I think in midterms it tends to be the same chatter pattern, at least in media, where it's going to be a blowout for the out of power party. Then when the in power party gets a little bit, things start to tighten. Then there's a lot of chatter about momentum, and they're going to keep power. And and so on and so forth. And then when things get back close to the election, everyone's like, oh, actually, it's probably the out of power party is probably going to have gains. Maybe not what we thought 6 months ago, but it would probably be a good night for them. And
we still have 2.5 weeks to go. So we've got like 4 more seesaws here where, the news cycle moves fast these days. So,
for people who want to keep up with that news cycle, especially on gun issues, if you follow the Reload, I think it only makes sense to follow Bearing Arms as well. How can people, find more of your writing as we get close? Because you're going to be writing a lot, I know, about this as we close into these last couple weeks of the election.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, I just wrote a subscriber exclusive story about the postmortems on Beto O'Rourke's campaign are already starting in the Texas media.
That's another common thing, right?
Exactly, right.
Everyone wants to write about these. They want to be first to do that.
So folks can just go to bearingarms.com. It's all the stories are free except for our VIP member stories. We've got a couple of those each and every day. And if you support the Reload, I would also ask you to give us a look and try to support us as well. We are also doing independent pro segment journalism. And we've got a VIP membership program where you can get exclusive news stories. But Cam and Company is also free of charge on all of the major podcast platforms, YouTube and Rumble. We do that Monday through Thursday. I was really pleased that Steve was able to come on the show today. And I hope that we're going to be able to do this again in the future, Stephen, without, the corporate minders getting in the way too much. It was smoothless so far. So I hope that continues. Yes.
Well, I have final say over where I get to go. I just try to be mindful of input from CNN whenever possible. So I will absolutely be on your show in the future, and I would encourage people to go over and check out Bearing Arms. You guys do a lot of great commentary, which really sets you what you're offering apart from what the Reload does. I think they're complementary. So people should check.
I think they're very complimentary, and we are very complimentary of you and the Reload. You do fantastic work. We actually love covering what you're doing. In addition to our own stuff. So, and we just added a few weeks ago, Ryan Petty as our latest contributor at Bearing Arms. His daughter Elena was one of the victims at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. And Ryan has I think a really unique story to tell. And I am looking forward to more of his contributions there on the website. So
same here. All right. Well, we're going to head over to the news update now. Thank you so much for joining us again this week, Cam.
You bet. Thanks, Stephen.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is time for the weekly news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined, of course, by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. How are you this week, Steve?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Jake?
Doing pretty good. See, you got your Phillies swag on, repping the team for the playoff run.
Yes, that's important to note for people who can't see, who aren't watching on YouTube. I'm wearing Phillies hat and jersey, and I've realized with the pace of playoff baseball, which the Phillies have not had to endure for the last 11 years, but I need more jerseys. They play these games like every day. I only have 2 jerseys. I need to get some more. I need to get a Harper jersey after he's leading, I believe, still home runs in this playoff postseason so far. So I think I need a jersey.
Got to rep a jersey one day, every day of the week.
Yes. Yeah. I need to go on a shopping spree.
So buy a Reload membership so he can go on that shopping spree.
Yeah. Yes.
But anyways, this week for the news, you're actually the news of the week. You made a big announcement that you're going to be joining a certain news network to provide a lot of the things that we provide here. If you want to tell us a little bit more about what's going on.
Yeah. So I'm becoming an analyst that's for CNN. As part of this new Guns in America beat that they're creating over there. And anyone who's been following me for any period of time probably knows that one of my main critiques of media coverage of firearms is that there just isn't a lot of knowledge about them in media. And a large part of that is due to the lack of focus on the issue. Like basically the only thing that gets consistent coverage that deals with guns in America are mass shootings. And there's no beat focused on firearms, just guns in America generally, beyond mass shootings. And so I'm encouraged to see that CNN is taking that seriously, and is bringing on someone like me. I think one of the largest drivers of poor media coverage of guns comes not from political bias, although that certainly does exist, but from just ignorance, really, lack of knowledge. And so that's an area where I think what CNN is doing is really beneficial. And as far as my role goes, I'm not in charge of how they cover firearms. I'm not running their news coverage there. I certainly will have, I'm sure, input on some of that, but I am an outside contributor. I don't work full time there. The Reload is going to remain my main focus. There will be no drop off in content or quality here. If anything, this will give us flexibility to expand, I think, in the future, as more people learn about the Reload from my appearances on CNN. But yeah, I mean, don't expect really anything to change. Certainly not for the worse at the Reload. We're going to remain committed to producing the same quality and quantity of content that we've been doing since we launched in 2021. And the big difference is that I'll be bringing the same perspective we've focused on here to CNN, a wider audience. And I think that'll be good.
That's excellent news. Like you said, that's really cool to see CNN taking this issue seriously beyond, as you said, just simply, every so often when a mass shooting happens, they decide to cover firearms. But it's cool to see that they're taking this issue seriously as a general American issue, because it is a facet of our life that guns play a role in the American way of life. You could tell us what exactly is.
Also, I should point out that they've hired several other reporters as well. An in-house reporter is going to be the lead for this issue area, the area of coverage. And then they've also hired a reporter from The Guardian and from The Trace. So, it's not like it's not like I'm the only one that they're bringing in to talk about this issue, but I think they've done a good job of trying to find, a number of different perspectives to bring in and have conversations that are more, about informing people rather than inflaming. That's at least how it's been presented to me, and I don't see any reason to doubt that to this point. And I'm hopeful that that's how things will go, and we'll be able to have nuanced conversations. I'm not going on there to be like a talking head who's doing a bunch of screaming debates. That's, as I think people who've followed this podcast or read the Reload know, that's not my style. That's not what I do. Instead, it'll be more focused on analyzing situations, trying to be accurate and fair to everyone involved, and just explain what's going on with guns in America.
Have they given you any indication on when you might be expected to make your first appearance, or when they're going to really get this thing going? I know a lot of people have been asking the kind of appearance schedule.
Yeah, I mean, there's no specific schedule.
Right.
I'm sure there's been some confusion about this, because people hear you get hired by CNN, they just assume that you're like going to have a show or whatever, and there's no like Stephen Gutowski hour. That this
Not yet.
Maybe someday.
Yeah,
but they've hired me as a contributor, as an analyst, so it'll be on an ad hoc basis when they have a story that they want some insight on about regarding firearms. That they'll reach out to me, and I can say yes or no. But I'll probably say yes as much as possible, just to be a useful resource for them. And so there's no like schedule that I can give people in terms of like turn on the TV. It'll be on I'll try to let people know as the appearances happen, right? And I'm sure we'll probably post them to the Reload when we have the ability to do that too. So it'll be, and I'm hopeful too that they're interested in when we have a story at the Reload that's that's of national interest, I'm sure that there'll be opportunities where I'll go on there and that we can talk about stories that we break here at the Reload. So, so honestly, you should keep following the Reload because you might get the stories here first and then see them on CNN potentially. So, but yeah, I'm not full time at CNN. I'm not starting a show. This isn't it's not like a round table show with the four of us who are part of this operation. It's at least not yet. And no one has talked to me about that. So it's not something like coming down the line tomorrow or whatever, but yeah, it's more of I'm an analyst. When there's a story related to my area of expertise, they'll reach out. Any of the individual shows that exist on CNN can reach out and ask me to come on. That's basically how it works.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like we said, that's cool news. Congratulations. But speaking of big stories and big news, we actually had one kind of happen the same day that you made this announcement, or maybe the day after. New update in the New York case that you wrote a story about. If you want to tell us what happened there.
Yeah, this is sort of a follow-up to a story that you wrote about just 2 weeks ago, which was New York's latest gun restrictions have now been found unconstitutional by another federal judge. This is the second time in 2 weeks that a federal judge has held parts of New York's Concealed Carry Improvement Act to be in violation of the Second Amendment under the new Supreme Court Bruin standard. This case dealt specifically with the total ban on carrying a gun in a place of worship, so church, synagogue, mosque, something like that. And effectively, the judge found that is there's no historical analog for a restriction like that, and it can't stand, and he issued a temporary restraining order against it while that goes into effect immediately. So unlike the previous case, where there was a stay put on that ruling, and which is still under a stay pending, an appeal to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. This case, the temporary restraining order goes into effect immediately, so it's already in effect in New York. The New York authorities can't enforce this ban on guns in being carried by licensed carriers in places of worship. So, and that's going to remain in effect until either it gets appealed and the Second Circuit Court of Appeals puts a stay on it, or there's a preliminary injunction hearing set for later this year. This is a temporary restraining order that we're talking about, and obviously the next step here is the preliminary injunction, which would be a more permanent block on the law. And so it's pretty fascinating to see how quickly the federal court system has gone after this new law that the New York legislature passed in response to the Supreme Court's ruling.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting distinction. You talked about how the fact that not only is it a TRO that was immediately in effect, it wasn't stayed to allow for an appeal. It's also a little bit more of a forceful ruling, I think, than even Sotheby. If you recall from the previous TRO that was granted against this law, he actually seemed to think that there was some leeway for the church ban. He made a little carve out for designated church security, for example. He said that they had to be allowed to carry. And it's an interesting update to see that this judge said there's no historical analog whatsoever for not allowing people in their own houses of worship to, if they're lawfully allowed to carry, to carry. So I think that's an interesting thing to note.
Yeah, there's definitely a little bit of conflict there between these two federal judges. I mean, they both find this provision to be unconstitutional. It's just
right.
The one, Sotheby is a fascinating ruling because he goes out of his way to sort of help both sides of the issue throughout that case, or he has gone out of his way. And, he initially tossed a case by the same plaintiffs. This was Gun Owners of America's, the Sotheby case, and Second Amendment Foundation and Firearms Policy Coalition is this new case that actually I think the judge's name is Sinatra. If I'm reading it correctly, I believe his last name is Sinatra. But so Judge Sinatra, and so that was Second Amendment and Firearms Policy Coalition, and the Second Amendment Foundation case is is laser focused on this one provision, whereas the GOA case is a much broader attack on the law. And Sotheby in the GOA case, he tossed the first attempt for lack of standing, and actually he's still raising some standing questions even as they proceed to the preliminary injunctions stage of that first case, or the GOA case, which is their second GOA case. And the SAF case is the third case, I guess, in the way that I'm explaining this. But now I've confused everyone. I apologize. But that GOA case, he basically tossed it initially on standing, but he explained to them essentially exactly how to find a plaintiff that has standing, which is what they did, and came back with a better case, and Sotheby ruled in their favor. But in that ruling, striking down on most of the controversial provisions of New York's law, he also rewrote some of them to, like, in some cases, literally wrote out what the legislature should pass. And so, he's taken a very interesting approach to the whole thing. I don't think I've ever seen a federal judge do that before, but he's effectively striking down these provisions, except where he can see some historical analog that would fit part of what the law is trying to do. And so that's what he was doing in the case with churches and synagogues and mosques. He was like, well, you can't ban everyone from carrying a gun. You have to make exceptions for security, people who are, I think it was people who are designated to be security for church. He found that was more suitable than a total ban, which is what New York had. Right. But obviously Sinatra doesn't do all of that. He doesn't go those extra steps. He just says, this is not, as written, it's not constitutional. And so it has to be blocked.
Right. Nevertheless, you're just seeing, like you said, in 2 weeks, multiple judges finding multiple portions of this law problematic under this new Bruin standard. It's pretty quick succession to see that there's a lot of problems that we're seeing in the federal judiciary with this law. And even as it's happening, we're seeing other jurisdictions considering copying this.
New Jersey, right?
New Jersey is right now debating a law that'll be in some ways more expansive, at least in terms of the sensitive places restrictions. So that's kind of an interesting thing to see right down the road there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why they believe they'll fare any better, but this is exactly what we predicted, right, when they passed this.
Right.
I believe the piece that I wrote at the time was New York tells the Supreme Court, thank you, sir, may I have another? Because they're basically just doing everything that the Supreme Court said they can't do. I don't know why anyone would be surprised by this outcome. Now, it's still the early stages. Temper it with that. Like, it hasn't reached the Second Circuit. We don't know what the Second Circuit is actually going to do with this case on the merits. They've been traditionally very friendly towards the state in its quest to restrict guns. They've been very favorable towards, or very, very, they've been very favorable towards the state's arguments about how their restrictions prevent gun violence or are meant to address gun violence or what have you. Now, they're not allowed to consider that anymore under the new ruling, and so they have to consider whether or not the law is in line with the Second Amendment and historical tradition in regulation of firearms. But so how they're going to adapt to that, we don't know to this point, but it's not looking good, certainly. I don't know what Governor Hochul expected, but certainly, or the gun control groups who helped write these laws, why they thought this was going to stand is unclear to me, frankly. But it's sort of happening exactly how we expected it to play out. So, we'll have to wait and see about what the Second Circuit does. But to this point, it's not looking good for New York's new law.
Right. No, it's kind of been a little bit of a free-for-all in the district court level of judges. You strike this down. You strike this down. So,
yeah. So we'll continue to follow this case, of course. and give you the latest updates alongside analysis of what's going on. And so if you want deeper insight into the happenings in the federal courts around Bruin, there's so much going on with that right now that it's kind of overshadowing the election. And you can kind of see that reflected, and people are not. I have another story, an analysis piece on how people are losing interest in guns as the election draws near. The New York Times just found only 1% of Americans put guns as their top issue for this election. So I have an analysis piece on that over at the Reload as well. If you want access to that piece and hundreds of more pieces of analysis that you cannot get anywhere else, head on over to thereload.com and check out our membership options today. We're actually having a sale, 20% off sale. So those don't happen very often. They don't last very long. So take advantage. If you have any interest in diving deeper into these issues, now's your chance. But until next week, that's all we've got for you.